Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Luther's Environmental Concerns Organization and the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement for a panel discussion on race and environmentalism. Before we begin, I would like to offer a recognition of the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories and offer this land acknowledgement. The land on which Luther College stands has been home to the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota people and their ancestors. As part of the neutral ground created by the US government to control the movement, lives, and livelihoods of Native peoples, this land was home to the Winnebago Ho-Chunk during their forced displacement from Wisconsin. This dispossession of the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota, and the forced migration of the Winnebago Ho-Chunk people was motivated by the interests of settlers, such as those who founded this town and this college. The Winnebago, during their residence here, addressed the land as grandmother. The tribe's orator, Wakan Dokora, believed his people were extended the blessing of this place by the Great Spirit, saying, "We did not make it, nor could we make it, so pretty and fair a land." Please honor this history and the ongoing connection of the descendants of these early residents to this place. Please also honor and care for the land, water, and resources as these residents did, like a loved and loving elder to whom we owe our life. Thank you. This event is presented collaboratively between Luther's Environmental Concerns Organization and Luther's Center for Ethics and Public Engagement. ECO is a student organization devoted to the development of environmental and social sustainability in the Luther community and beyond. And the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement is a campus center focused on enriching the liberal arts education by engaging students, faculty, staff, and community members in ethical reflection about the many challenging issues that affect the public, locally, nationally, and globally. These two organizations on campus identified a need for greater conversation on the intersections between racism and the poignant environmental challenges plaguing our society in the age of the climate crisis. We wanted to highlight the experiences of individuals, recognizing that every story is unique. Tonight, we hope to start an exploration of this topic through conversation with our panelists. Our panelists this evening are Sletsy Dlamini, Dr. Fikirte Erda, and Salome Valdeviezo. We will begin with Sletsy Dlamini. Sletsy is a senior environmental studies major with a focus in environmental science. Originally from Eswatini, Sletsy attended the United World College of Changshu, China, and has spent time at Luther exploring the multiple facets of sustainability. Last spring, Sletsy participated in the Rochester semester, where he interned with the City of Rochester Destination Medical Center Economic Development Agency and contributed to Rochester's Sustainability and Resiliency Task Force. At Luther, Sletsy also participates in track and field and is a member of Student Senate, where he serves as the International Student Representative. Sletsy is also the Vice President of Luther's Black Student Union. Please welcome Sletsy Dlamini.
Thank you very much, Piper, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. As Piper just mentioned in the introduction, I am from the small country of Eswatini, which is located in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the perspective that I'm hoping to bring today is how environmental injustice is affecting countries like mine, as well as how I have seen that play out in Eswatini and affecting me personally too. So I'm just gonna quickly share a graphic that I think really just helps describe what I'm gonna be talking about today. And that is this graphic. And you can read the words, those who contribute the least greenhouse gases will be most impacted by climate change. And when you look at the graphic, you can clearly see that the top is showing the greatest emitters, and those are the developing countries, or the countries that are usually referred to as the global north. And the part below is showing the countries that will be mostly affected or that are most vulnerable to climate change. You can clearly see those are the countries in the Southern Hemisphere, most of them developing countries and countries that are predominantly occupied by people of color. And so, like I said, if you're familiar with the environmental movement, then the phrase saying climate change is disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable communities is something that you've probably heard countless times. And it is just as true on a global scale as it is on a local scale. The countries that have historically contributed the least to global warming and climate change will or are unfortunately already getting the short end of the stick when it comes to experiencing the severity of climate change and its effect on the people, on economies, and on natural systems. We know that developed countries like the US and countries in Europe have gotten to where they are today by emitting a lot of greenhouse gases and exploiting not only natural resources, but also people of color in many ways. And these developed countries have gotten to a point where their economies afford them some cushion from the harm of climate change in the form of being able to transition to renewables, being able to build resilient infrastructure and employ a variety of expensive strategies for climate mitigation and adaptation. Basically all the things that developing countries can only dream of. So when climate catastrophes do strike, developing countries can really feel the impact of that. After mentioning this, before I continue, I think it's important to acknowledge that even within developed countries, racial and economic class discrepant environmental injustices exist. And I think it is necessary that I mention that and that we grasp that in order to understand that it isn't just about developed versus developing countries. People of color are disadvantaged all around, everywhere, developed countries and developing countries. Anyway, so me being from a developing country located in the part of the world that is projected to experience more frequent, more intense periods of drought and more climate variability in the future, it is especially troubling because my country, Eswatini, is highly reliant on agriculture. And so that makes us vulnerable to climate change and any variabilities in the climate. Agriculture makes up a huge sector of our economy and of our exports. And more importantly, a huge part of our population relies on subsistence farming for household sustenance. A lot of our population still lives in the rural areas. Over 70% of our population does, and they grow the food that they eat. And I myself come from a family just like that. You know, I have memories of being young and working in the fields with my cousins, driving oxen to cultivate the land, planting, weeding, and harvesting our food. But when I went home this past December over our circuit breaker here at Luther, there was nothing in the fields. And by the way, it's growing season in the Southern Hemisphere right now, so it's not weird at all that I expected something to be in the fields. Anyway, it turns out that my family hasn't actually grown anything over the past couple of years, maybe 5 or so, because there hasn't been much rain. The country experienced a severe drought in 2016 and annual rainfall has been on the decline, especially in the low-lying parts of the country since then. And so trying to grow anything right now is actually quite a gamble because you risk losing all your crops to the heat. And needless to mention, something like this disproportionately affects low-income households and smaller subsistence farmers because they generally rely on rainfall to grow their crops. And so because they cannot afford to finance other irrigation methods such as maybe boreholes or drawing water over long distances from rivers. So right now, my family, along with others that rely on subsistence farming, have to resort to buying food from stores or other producers in more moist regions of the country. And so you can see how anthropogenic climate change is threatening food security in these countries. And not only just generally, but also in these countries, it's threatening the most vulnerable communities. So low-income communities, which are mostly communities of color, are the ones that are more vulnerable to such changes. And this is putting a financial strain on these households, and it's threatening the country's economy too. And that can, start a chain of negative effects for a lot of things when people cannot grow their food and the country's economy is declining as well. And And just one other thing, beyond food security and the economy, people are also losing food sovereignty. They're losing the ability to have a say or to control how their food is grown. And so when getting food is just as simple as picking it up at the store, you are robbed of an opportunity to have a relationship with the food that you eat. It hits different when you know the food, every step of the way from its growing to its harvesting. You have a relationship with it. And with climate change and severe droughts and people not being able to grow their own food, low income households and just a large part of our population in general are not only being robbed of, not only experiencing or at a threat to experience food insecurity, but they're also being robbed of that opportunity to have a relationship with their food. And so that is something that is culturally important that we're losing. And Swaziland is just one of many developing countries that are facing this problem of disproportionate distribution of climate change impacts. A lot of other countries, developing countries, are experiencing the same, and it is going to continue to be a problem unless we do something about it as a people. So not just expecting developing countries to act by themselves. I think as a people globally, we need to start doing something or continue doing something about climate change and helping developing countries as well, especially considering that a lot of the developed countries got to where they are by exploiting developing countries. And even today, developed countries continue to outsource or fund extractive practices in developed countries that do harm to the environment. So that is something that is happening to developing countries. That is something that I've seen happen to my country. And it is something that has affected me personally or my family. And I just wanted to share that today. So thank you for coming tonight. And I will leave the rest of the time to questions.
Thank you so much, Sletsy, for sharing your experiences. And we really appreciate you telling us so much and kind of giving us an opportunity to visualize what it looks like at home right now in Eswatini. I was curious, how has your time, you've lived in Eswatini, you've lived in China, and you've also lived in the United States here in Decorah, in Rochester, and how have those experiences in those different places influenced your perspective on the climate crisis and maybe environmental injustices? Do you see these things looking different in every context globally, or do they look, does environmental injustice look the same across the board?
Thank you. That is an interesting question. And just interestingly, I think it has been a journey for me with the environmental movement from just being back home when I was young. I didn't think of it much. I grew up around the environment. I grew up growing our food, and I didn't think of it as like doing something sustainable. It was just like our way of life. And it wasn't until I grew older and I started learning about all the different things that are happening around the world and how different practices and different things that we do for our well-being as people in the world are impacting the environment. And so it has been a journey, and now I'm in college and I know a lot more than I did back then. But I think when it comes to environmental injustice, I would say there are some differences and similarities. The biggest differences, maybe the biggest similarities being the fact that in either countries, especially if I'm comparing Swaziland to the United States, in either countries, environmental injustice and the impacts of climate change are disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable people in those countries. So in the US, same thing is happening, whereas whereby the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable communities and historically marginalized communities are the ones that are getting the short end of the stick. It is the same thing in Swaziland, even though as a country, we are getting the short end of the stick, but internally, the people that have affluence, the people that have wealth can sort of get some cushion to that. And then the most vulnerable people, like I said, that maybe rely on subsistence farming to sustain their families, are suffering the most. And I think some differences maybe, I come from a country that is predominantly Black. And so within the country, maybe environmental injustice isn't as clearly defined by racial lines. Whereas in the United States, I think you can see that a lot of the times the people that are suffering the most, even if we disregard economic class, it's people of color.
Thank you so much for sharing such a great understanding of kind of a global perspective of climate injustice and environmental injustices. You spoke a bit recently about the subsistence farming element. You've talked about it quite a bit throughout your presentation, looking at maybe how it's changed even in your time at Luther, climate-wise at home. And I'm just curious how you maybe envision in the short and long term how your family's way of life with subsistence farming might change in regards to the climate crisis.
It's really hard to say, because, as we know, the climate is unpredictable, and there's not really much we can do with that. And I don't know, except maybe hope that Mother Nature can hit us with a stimulus check of a couple millimeters of rainfall a year. But I think the next best thing that I'm hoping for my family and a lot of other Swazis is to still be able to access food that is locally grown. And so with, the droughts that we're currently experiencing in the area that I'm from right now, I do not foresee my family or a lot of the people that are around us taking that risk of trying to grow something, especially because we cannot afford to kind of employ all these other techniques that maybe other people can. So we cannot afford to employ other techniques of irrigation or anything like that. So I think the next best thing that we can hope for is that we're still able to access locally grown food from maybe other farmers that are local, that are maybe just located in parts of the country that still have rainfall. And so, yeah, I think that's it. And in the long term, it's just kind of the same thing with climate change. I think, the weather and the seasons are just going to vary even more. So there's no knowing when it's a good time to grow and when it's not. So it's just hard to say.
We have a question from one of our audience members, and they are wondering, given kind of the pastoral nature that you've talked about of your family's subsistence farming, they're wondering if climate change has led to any increased urbanization in Eswatini, and what impacts that urbanization might have on your family's way of life in the future.
I think as a developing country over the past couple of years, there has been an increase in urbanization. And I am not sure how much of that has been due to, the droughts and kind of like the people's inability to grow their own food. But that is something that is happening. And I think in developing countries, we sort of look at Western countries and look at how urbanized they are. And most people kind of idolize that. And so that is something that is happening, growing. But we still have a majority of our population in the rural areas. Like I said, over 70% is still in rural areas. And so it's not as drastic as maybe in some other developing countries.
Thank you so much, Sletsy, for sharing. And we'll probably chat with you toward the end of our panel. But now we're going to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Fikirte Erda, who is a professor of biology here at Luther. Dr. Erda is a visiting professor with a PhD in zoology from Oklahoma State University, and her research interests are focused on community-based wildlife conservation, large carnivore conservation, spatial ecology, and environmental education. Dr. Erda worked on a large carnivore conservation project for the past 10 years in Ethiopia and teaches courses at Luther, including human-wildlife conflicts, principles of biology, geographic information systems, and animal behavior. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fikirte Erda.
Thank you, Piper, for that introduction. And thanks everyone for joining in today. And it's lovely to be here. And I will start my talk, which is the environmental injustice from a conservationist's perspective. And I'll be talking about what environmental justice or injustice is as a conservationist to me. And I'll focus on how I'll draw on a case study with lion conservation from Africa. But first, I would like to start by providing a definition of what environmental justice is. So the United States EPA defines the environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And when I see this definition, two things stand out for me. So in an ideal world, we're saying that environmental justice is people would get equal treatment, and they would have equal access to benefits from their environment, and they would have their voices heard equally in the decision-making process to contribute toward a healthy environment to live, to learn, to work, to raise their family, etc., is the same across the board. So that's what we're saying. But the two things that stand out for me are, the first one is this idea of fair treatment. So when we say fair treatment, the EPA also defines it as to mean that no particular group or no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences that result from be it industrial or governmental or commercial operations or policies, and that all societies and all members will have the same degree of protection. But as you all know, that's very challenging because some communities do not have the wealth or the means to protect themselves. So what ends up happening is mostly the weakest in society bear the heaviest weight, and they pay disproportionately for our increased consumerism and developmental or industrial indifference. As an example from my experience in Ethiopia with unfair treatment that I can draw is the case of flower farms in Ethiopia. I did a project on 2 flower farms in Ethiopia when I was doing my master's, and there still are a number of public concerns with regard to flower production in Ethiopia. These include, a lot of things, but the type and amount of chemicals that are used by the flower farms, and the significant environmental impact that they have, the environmental pollution, the cattle dying, the algal blooms because of inappropriate waste disposal, the deterioration in quality and quantity of water bodies, all these, and the treatment of workers there. So all these fall within the fair or unfair treatment. The second element that stands out for me is the concept of this meaningful involvement. By meaningful involvement, the EPA particularly lists these 4 ideas, being the opportunity to participate in decision, where communities or people will have equal opportunity to participate in the decision, or the public's contribution will influence policies or regulatory agencies' decisions, or the community concerns will be considered while decision-making processes are taking place, and that decision makers will facilitate the involvement of those that are potentially affected by what's going on the ground. So from these 4 elements, I would like us to focus on these 2, and I would like to talk about my experience looking at the lion conservation researchers in all of Africa. So this is from a paper, from a research my colleagues and I carried out, and a paper published 2 years ago. And like Piper said, I'm a large carnivore conservationist by profession, and I have worked on large carnivores, and this is one of my published research. So on with this research, what we did was we downloaded papers written about African lions, and we listed all authors that had 3 or more papers. And then we categorized these authors based on their race, nationality, and gender. So it was Black versus non-Black, male versus female, and their nationality as being African versus non-African. One thing that I would like to point out is the African lion is one of the most emblematic African species, and it occurs predominantly in Africa, and it only occurs outside of Africa in one protected area in India. So it's pretty much it's an African species. So we had about 615 papers of interest, and from those we had about 199 people with 3 or more papers. From those, only 10 were Black, and only 61 of those authors were Africans. 61 were women, and what that meant was if we had 60 Africans, then 50 of them were non-Blacks, and there were no non-Black. There were no Black non-Africans. So there were no African Americans to speak of, or there were no people of color. And South Africa had the highest non-Black African researchers, but they had 0 Black researchers. So that was very striking. And you can see the composition in male and female researchers also. It was only the Black African researcher community that had sort of a 60-40 proportion. But in all of the others, you can see that there was a higher skewness towards the males. So now you may ask, why is she talking about this? Why is this relevant? This is relevant because when we see the composition of these researchers, we say that policy affects environmental justice. So this kind of composition will facilitate a power imbalance. What this analysis revealed to us is that locals are mostly included as, it's not that they're not there, they are there, but they are there as cheap daily laborers or as data collectors in the research, and not as publishers, not as scientists, not as people who communicate these researchers. So there is a power imbalance. And with that power imbalance, then you have this creation of an environmental or a conservation model that perpetuates this dependence on external skill, or sort to say an extroverted model. So if we're working to conserve a species that's predominantly existing in Africa, an African lion, then in their natural habitat, then we should work toward capacity building of locals. We should work towards that. If we fail to do so, then we are continuing to depend on external skill sets, and we are further contributing to the formation of unsustainable conservation models. These unsustainable conservation models mean that the knowledge we are creating is not readily accessible locally, and that these models lack a functional system and they cannot stand crisis. For example, we published a paper this past December about how in South Africa and Southeastern Africa, the conservation model is that if it pays, it stays sort of model. And it was highly dependent on tourism from external Western visitors, and it collapsed in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. So not having grassroots or local people contributing toward the conservation, toward the research, is that it cannot stand such crises. So having discussed these consequences, let us go back to the elements of those, meaningful involvement that we highlighted recently. So to me, without local capacity building and true integration of local researchers, then it is very unlikely that we will have a true successful, a true meaningful involvement of local people or local scientists. And that means that these local scientists or these local people will not be equipped enough to influence the regulations or the policies that come. And then the decisions that are being meant by these external bodies may not fully capture, or sometimes they may disregard community concerns. So then we would remain in that vicious circle of environmental injustice from a conservation perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erda, for sharing a snapshot into your research. I was curious where you kind of got the idea, or what prompted you to be an author on this paper, or what interested you in the topic of kind of the behind the scenes elements of the justice component of the research that you do.
So this is something, since I was an undergrad or a master's student, I hear my seniors or everyone in a panel, in a seminar, in a workshop, all people talk about this, but it's something that was never quantified. So we wanted to understand if it is just a tiny problem that everyone talks about, or if it's really a problem, and it ended up being a problem. So.
And we have a question from our audience. Someone is wondering if there is currently change occurring in terms of the demographics of researchers, and how quickly that might be changing, and if there's any policies in terms of promotion of more diverse researchers, or bias against women or like people of color in the workplace, or in this case, making sure that Africans can be a part of this research and are a major element in this research, instead of a reliance on outside non-African researchers.
I want to say yes, but I honestly do not know how much of change there has been. But one good feedback that came after the publication of this paper was that a lot of people say it was eye-opening, and we are noticing that a lot of research groups or universities are taking local researchers to do their graduate studies. So that will definitely bring a change. When? We don't know yet. But in terms of policies from nationals that have lions, there isn't a lot currently. And that is something that, again, sometimes if, what is that saying? Sometimes it might be the majority, or the people with power, the not marginalized in the room, who has the strongest voice to counteract the marginalized or the minority. So it is still, there is a lot of work to be done from the Western scientists in encouraging this policy from the nations, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have a question from a Luther student who is wondering, as a biologist, how do you recommend the inclusion and recognition of Indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge in scientific studies, especially in relation to the idea of the incorporation of local voices in positions of power in research?
I believe that is something that's very important, and there is a huge field of traditional Indigenous knowledge in ecology or in other disciplines of biology that tries to integrate local people's voices or these Indigenous knowledge into the mainstream science. But I think what we lack is teaching our undergrads or teaching our young minds at high school or at the college level that these things could also have some scientific merit, could also be useful in the future, because mostly what I notice is when conservationists go to the field to do a research, they come with the mentality that they are going to solve a problem and that locals do not know, or that locals do not have an opinion because they don't know. So that is usually where we are wrong, and that is where we have to train our undergraduates, our high school students to be cognizant of this fact. But I think it's important.
Thank you so much for sharing. In the interest of time, we will move on to our next panelist, but we will probably be speaking with you a little bit at the end as well, Dr. Erda. So thank you very much. Our next panelist is Salome Valdeviezo. Salome is a sophomore, double majoring in anthropology and international studies at Luther, and she is originally from Ecuador, but has spent time studying abroad in Senegal, Norway, and now finds herself in Decorah, Iowa. Through these experiences, Salome has been able to reflect on the connections between people and their environments and apply those reflections to her studies. Salome works as a resident assistant, she works at the Spanish table, and is a student outreach coordinator for the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement on campus. Salome is also the president of Luther's Intersectional Feminist Club and the secretary on the International Student ISAA, International Student and Allies Association. Please welcome Salome Valdivieso.
Thank you, Piper, and thank you to my fellow panelists for sharing your stories and insights, and thank you everyone for attending this panel. As Piper mentioned, I'm from Ecuador, and it's a tiny country in the equator in Latin America, and despite its size, it's one of the most diverse countries in the world. So here's where my experience fighting against environmental injustice started. In 2012, Rafael Correa, then president of Ecuador, started a campaign to extract the oil underground the Yasuní National Park, a national reserve in the rainforest. That is recognized by the UNESCO as one of the world hotspots of diversity and home for contacted and not contacted indigenous people, just to mention some of them, the Guarani and the Tagomenani. After the announcements of President Correa, an environmental activist group named Yasunidos started a campaign to collect signatures to open a referendum so the Ecuadorian people could decide if oil should be extracted or not from this national reserve. So I decided to join Yasunidos the same year. And I remember that most of our work was mainly based on collecting signatures in a park close to my house. We used to go there from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. every evening, and we used to approach people that were just passing by in their cars, people who just came to play in the park. And surprisingly, a lot of people didn't know that this was happening in the country. We just approached everyone and started talking about why was this an issue. And people were quite annoyed by us, I will say, because we were there every day. So by the end of the campaign, Yasunidos collected more than 7,500 signatures, and that was 10,000 more signatures needed for the ones needed to open a referendum in the country and decide if the oil should be extracted or not from Yasuní National Park. So regardless of that campaign, President Correa did not recognize most of the signatures, alluding that the signatures were fake. And the Electoral College in my country invalidated a lot of the signatures with not funded reasons. Like they were like, oh, this signature is with black pen, so we're not gonna count, or this paper is a scratch, so we're gonna delete this signature. By the end of that campaign, sadly, Correa started to extract the oil. For me, this was a wake-up call to understand what environmental racism and environmental injustice really meant. Despite the failed attempt to stop oil extraction in the Yasuní and in a lot of other reserves in Ecuador, Yasunidos deeply impacted the environmental fight in my country and around the world, especially because it brought to light the unity of a country that was joined for a cause. And at the same time, it brought to light the fact that indigenous voices are not recognized in a land that historically belongs to them. The fight didn't start or finish with Yasunidos. There are still many Ecuadorian indigenous activists that keep fighting for recognizing their rights. And at the same time, they fight for spaces of power in the government. That is usually where the decisions are made about extracting resources. So, the land is crucial for Indigenous survival and resistance. And just to mention two Indigenous women that have deeply inspired me personally are the Sarayaku leaders Helena and Nina Walinga, and the Guarani activist Nemonte Nenquino, who recently won the Goldman Prize last year. Women like Nina, Elena, and Nemonte have fought and keep fighting for the protection of the rainforest in Ecuador, but they cannot fight alone. So it's our job, and I take this personally. I think that is also my job as an Ecuadorian citizen to, just turn their attention to their fight as Indigenous leaders who are reclaiming their rights for autonomy and for a clean environment. That is the right of every person who has a place in this world. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Salome, for sharing, and thank you for sharing the names of other activists who are fighting for the preservation of the rainforest. We have a few questions coming in, and I'm just curious if, and I asked a similar question of Sletsy as someone who's lived in many different places as well, but how has your experience kind of been shaped by the places in which you've called home? And has that experience, or does that environmental injustice look different in Ecuador than it does when you're here in Decorah, or in Norway or in Senegal? How does that different injustice kind of play out for you?
Yeah, I think that, when I left Ecuador, I left very disappointed at the political leadership that my country had at the time, especially because the Yasuni was a national reserve and it was meant to be protected. So I left the country very frustrated. And then I moved to Norway. So for me, Norway used to be like the utopia, like you see countries like Norway that are super like progressive in environmental activism, and their policies tend to be like set an example for other countries to follow. However, when I went to Norway, I also realized that Indigenous voices are being silenced, particularly the Sami people have been fighting a lot for their rights and their autonomy, similarly to Ecuador. And we don't hear these things in the news. Like, we tend to only focus, as Sletsy said, on developing countries and kind of like putting all the blame on us. But developed countries are also doing the same. So in the case of Norway, sadly, Norway is also one of the countries that heavily relies on oil. So that's not different from the case in Ecuador. However, again, we just tend to blame countries like Ecuador that have been historically exploited. And we also don't recognize that most of the oil goes to developed countries. Like, most of the oil companies in Ecuador are from the United States and from China. However, still the blame is put on us as a nation rather than, keeping these other countries accountable. And Norway is sadly doing also the same.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights on that topic. I'm curious, in terms of leadership, do you see any hope for a change in the relationship between Indigenous populations in Ecuador and the government in Ecuador? And I guess, what do you think needs to happen for those relationships to maybe heal or to transform?
Yeah, I think that definitely there is a lot of changes happening, especially now that we live in the age of globalization. I am very pleased to, see more of Indigenous voices in online platforms. So a lot of, panels and discussions had happened during this pandemic that are open more to the public. And I'm very, just like last month, I attended a panel where one of the Indigenous leaders in Brazil was, hosting this panel from her side in the Amazon, that before she will have to travel to other places. However, I think that holding power in a political level is key to have these changes. And in the case of Ecuador, I think that is a necessity that we need Indigenous leaders making these decisions. Correa was praised for his very progressive constitution in 2008, where indigenous cosmovision was being recognized as a key aspect of the Ecuadorian identity. However, what I see with a lot of this constitution and a lot of these laws is that it's more performative. So a lot of the world leaders praise Correa for having these changes, but in the ground, these changes did not happen because indigenous people were not included in these political developments. So I think that instead of having this paternalistic kind of way of doing politics, indigenous leaders need to be at the table. And at the same time, for me, it's very surprising that, we praise a lot of people like, a lot of young activists like Greta Thunberg, but we are not hearing about these indigenous leaders that are also making the changes from the field. Like Elena and Nina are around the same age as Greta, but I don't know if people have heard about them. And that's sadly the rhetoric, right? Like we tend to just center or focus on these leaders from developed countries and not to indigenous leaders. And those are the ones who are being affected and whose lands are being exploited by our consumist way of living.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I have a student asking if there's any way that students at Luther can assist or contribute to making changes in Ecuador. So if you want to share any resources you have on that question, that would be great.
Thank you so much for that question, whoever it was. I think this is very important. I think that international community can have a lot of impact in countries like Ecuador, because countries in Ecuador, like our economy sadly relies on countries like United States and China. So like in this case, most of the students in Luther are from the United States. So holding your government accountable for, providing safety and environmental extraction policies is key in places like Ecuador. Right now, Nemonte Nequino is fighting against the Ecuadorian state for the recognition of an oil spill that happened in the Yasuni 2 years ago. So right now they are collecting signatures. If you go to guaraniresistant.com, you can sign up the petition and you can also make donations to help the indigenous leaders. They need a lot of transportation and they need a lot of legal advices. So this will help them finance these two resources. However, again, I think that, just us raising our voice, sharing social media has impacted a lot of the fights of environmental activists. And, it just fueled them to keep fighting for these resources, opening the platform. The UN, the UNESCO has to also open the spaces for indigenous voices. And that's how we can keep them accountable. That's how you, Luther students, can keep them accountable to in a local level.
Thank you so much, Salome. It's great to hear of ways that we can, work together to kind of become the global citizens of the world that we are trying to here at Luther College. I will move on to opening this up to all of our panelists so that we can ask a few more questions and maybe, reflect on the conversation that we've had this evening. My first question is from the audience, and someone is wondering, folks in this panel have mentioned the disproportionate impacts on people of color in the climate crisis and climate change, how it impacts those populations in a different way than it might impact most of the folks here in rural Iowa. And they were wondering if there were examples of how that might affect people in the US or in this region differently than it affects people in parts of rural Iowa where there might not be as much diversity. So do you have any examples or any personal experiences of the disproportionate impacts that climate change has played in your lives, or stories that you know of that you might be willing to share?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think there are a lot of examples, especially in the US, of climate change disproportionately affecting people of color. and also just not only climate change, other environmental issues disproportionately affecting people of color. And so maybe the most environmental injustice issue that most people have probably heard about is, the pipeline in North Dakota that was being scheduled or planned to be put on native land. And so things like that have happened a lot historically. Native people or people of color being displaced in order to serve interests of corporations. Besides pipelines, things like highways are usually located where people of color live, and people of color are more likely to live or be located near maybe coal mines or power plants where there's a lot of pollution. And so just a lot of things like that are happening in the US, and maybe people are not aware of them in predominantly white rural areas, but it's happening, especially in cities. There's a lot of evidence of that. In the US, you have the practice of redlining, and there's a lot of that can be seen along those lines of redlining where people of color do not have access to simple things such as green infrastructure, and live in very poor neighborhoods and with a lot of maybe hazardous waste and things of that nature. So yeah, those are things that are happening in the US.
Thank you, Sletsy. And a question for everyone on the panel. What bright spots or areas of opportunity, and you all have kind of touched on this a little bit, but maybe to get us ending on a positive note, what bright spots or areas of opportunity do you see in the future for maybe the advancement of either understanding or the possibility of greater representation in the environmental movement of people of color? Are there any places where you see a lot of hope for kind of the fixing these issues that we have talked about this evening?
To me, the bright spots or the opportunities that I see are, first, there is an increased consciousness. And this is something from my own country in Ethiopia. There, pretty much everyone is now informed of climate change. Is it to the level that we want? Probably not. Has it led to maybe sometimes some sort of appropriation? It does. But the discourse is there, and people are starting to get information, and it's starting to become a household topic, which is a good thing. Another potentially opportunity that I see is that a lot of industries are now becoming green, at least in the West or in developing nations. They could be greenwashed, but I believe that is how it starts. So that is another positive thing. And but one thing that I am starting to notice, especially with young folks and the upcoming generation, is that a lot of people are starting to get to be comfortable with the discourse of our intersectionality, or people are starting to understand how their social, political, cultural, economic, or any other identities create different aspects of discrimination and privilege. So that concept of understanding our intersectionality, I think, is a huge step toward the light at the end of the tunnel, I believe. Thank you.
I, to be honest, see a lot of hope here in the academic community, in the sense that, for example, last semester, I was very honored to have a class about environmental anthropology, where for the first time I read a book about oil extraction in Ecuador. So a shout out to my Professor Carrasco. Thank you so much for teaching this class. And to be honest, yeah, just, us being able to learn about these issues that before we didn't even hear about. And this is thank you to globalization, to, again, social media, to people who just kind of like, bring this to our attention. But we here in the United States, we don't know how lucky we are to have access to all of these resources. So, just being able to pick a book and learn about these issues are a key step to keep fighting about environmental justice. So I invite all of my peers who are in this panel today to, go a little bit outside of your comfort zone and, be, as Piper was mentioning, this is a step to becoming global citizens. I think that a lot of the environmental fight cannot be just, centered in one nation, because a lot of nations are contributing to environmental justices in parts of the world, like Ecuador, where, again, all the extraction happens because of the way that people consume here in the US. And if you think about it, everything has oil. So we all can be informed about these issues. And I'm not telling you, move away to the jungle and don't ever use your phone again, because, sadly, we cannot really make those drastic changes. But to get informed and a little bit, make more conscious choices about what kind of lifestyle do you want to have has an impact on places like the rainforest in Ecuador, where all extraction affects directly indigenous people. And this impacts access to water, access to food, and it impacts in ways that we cannot even think about because of the relationship between land and indigenous people. It's something that sometimes we don't think about. So yeah, I invite you all to read more about these issues. And again, thank you so much for organizing this panel. I think this is also a great way to start a conversation about environmental justice.
With developing countries, I think maybe one thing that we can see as a positive is that we sort of have the blueprint, right? We've seen how developed countries have done things and what that has resulted in. And so I think it would be tragic if developing countries followed exactly on the footsteps of developed countries. I think we have an opportunity to explore new ways. And so I think investment in research and employing alternative ways of doing things. So not just really putting all our efforts in burning fossil fuels, but rather looking at alternative ways of doing things is something that developing countries have an opportunity to do. Just try new things, and the developed world can make some contributions to that in the form of funding for research, for development, and things of that nature. And I think developed countries, corporations, institutions in the developed world have the ability to do that and help out developing countries.
Thank you all so much for sharing what feels like moments of opportunity and some momentum, hopefully, from this panel to start these conversations at the college level. I want to thank you all for joining us for this panel discussion in this very new and different format. I appreciate everyone's flexibility and ability to just log on to a Zoom and spend time with us this evening. A special thank you to our panelists for taking the time to share their stories and personal experiences and speak with us this evening. Thank you to the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement for sponsoring the event, and thank you to the Environmental Concerns Organization for their hard work in organizing and facilitating the development of this panel. We hope that this evening can serve as a beginning to a larger conversation on campus around the topic of racism in environmentalism and how we can better understand one another's experiences. Again, if you would like to continue this conversation, this is in the chat. There are a few great links in the chat that have been dropped in there throughout the evening. But if you would like to continue this conversation with us, ECO, the Environmental Concerns Organization, will be hosting a discussion tomorrow night at 7:30 p.m. And you can find the link to that Zoom meeting on the ECO Instagram. And there's also a link in the chat function of this Zoom meeting. Thank you also to the ITS department for assisting with the behind the scenes and technical work and making all of this happen. I certainly would be very lost without the work of the ITS department. So thank you very much. And to the crew of students and staff working behind the scenes this evening, Kristen Underwood from the campus programming, Krista Holland from the CEPE, Natalia Cadena, and Carolyn Reitzman from ECO for all of their hard work. We appreciate everyone tuning in tonight and hope that this is the beginning of a longer conversation. So thank you so much and have a great evening.